All right, we are in Matthew chapter 26, ready to begin chapter 20. Did want to show you some slides of what Jerusalem looks like today if you will visit. You can see the temple there with the gold dome. And then what we're standing on really is right up there where the Mountain of Olives is, and all of those square-looking things, if you look straight at the bottom of the picture, are actually tombs. And everybody has to be buried a certain way, according to the way that they view things. Otherwise, you're not going to be resurrected when resurrection day comes. There's a little bit closer picture of the Dome of the Rock. You can see the old city gate right in front of that. That's under Muslim control. It's the most sacred site for the Jews because that's where the temple was built and located and so on. So the fact that it's under Muslim control is a great sorrow to the Jews. And the Wailing Wall, which you've certainly heard about, is the Wailing Wall because that is the closest place to the temple. And so the fact that they're wailing at that particular wall is indicative that they've lost access to this temple. And when you look at it, you can see it definitely has Muslim architecture to it, as opposed to the way the Jews would have constructed something. All right, so looking at Matthew chapter 26, this is what we've studied so far. At the end of the final speech section, seventh death prediction on the part of Jesus. The plot to kill Jesus is finalized. He is anointed for burial. Judas's betrayal, and we talked about the 30 pieces of silver being the price paid for a wounded slave. And then in verses 20 through 25, which is where we begin today, Jesus predicts Judas's betrayal, but Judas doesn't see what's going on. It says, now when evening had come, he was reclining at table with 12 disciples. Now the fact that he's reclining shows that this was considered to be a formal meal. They would sit, as we would say, Indian style. Sometimes they would use chairs like we might sit at a table today. But if it was a formal meal, they would recline. And so the Passover meal is that which is considered to be a formal meal. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you, that one of you will betray me. And being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. Now the text says that every one of them was saying that, and we have no reason to suspect that Judas wasn't also saying, no, surely it's not me, is it? And he answered and said, he who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. Now, in Oriental fashion, bread was dipped into a common bowl. To betray one that you would actually share a meal with was considered to be the ultimate of hardness of heart. If you could share a meal, but still have on your mind betrayal. So this was as low as one could get to do this and still be betraying Jesus. He says, the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man for whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Now the crucifixion was something that was prophesied in the Old Testament. but it didn't mean that the betrayer was any less guilty. So Jesus issues here a woe against that betrayer. And Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." And he said to him, "You have said it yourself." Now this was an affirmative answer, even though Judas repeated the question that everybody else had asked. But no one else, including Judas, is still not seeing himself as a betrayer. Now those that would say, well, yeah, he probably was at least at some level, are arguing that what Judas got from this was a thumbs up from Jesus. You're the guy, go ahead and do what it is that you're doing. Now, I have trouble seeing Judas as going, all right, Jesus said it was okay for me to go forward, when Jesus had just said, the guy that does this, it had been better for him not to have been born. But anyway, you've got people that have different slants on that. It just seems like the evil heart of Judas has taken hold, and he is doing what it is that he wants to do. Maybe not for the money necessarily, but certainly to force the hand of Jesus. All right, then verses 26 through 35 is a section about the Lord's Supper. Now while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat." Now that part would have been normal. "This is my body." That is not normal. Now, each time that Jesus took a portion, he prayed, he gave a blessing, the text says. And then when he called it, "This is my body," this is what's called a metonymy. He does the same thing in verse 27. He took a cup and he gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many." All right, so he takes the cup, and they told to drink from it. Now, there are a number of things that we discuss about this. First of all, should we have just one cup? And those that argue that we should have just one cup fail to appreciate that there is no significance given in the biblical text for the vessel itself, for the cup. But what was in the cup is what is significant. And then when he says that this is my body and this is my blood, that also, both of those form what is known as a metonymy, where a part represents something else. So the bread represents his body. The fruit of the vine represents his blood. So, through the years, I've had an occasional person object to the language used during the Lord's Supper, saying the Bible never says that this represents his body, or it represents his blood. But in understanding language and understanding what a metonymy is, then representation is the right word, and it's an acceptable word to use if you're presiding at the Lord's table. And so the question is asked, is the cup what is significant, or or is what is in the cup, getting back to those that argue for there being one cup. Notice verse 27 says, and he took a cup. He just took a cup. Nothing significant. And presumably this is one of 4 cups that they would have drank from during the Passover meal. So, reiterating once again, the cup is not significant. And also, you're not drinking the cup, you're drinking from the cup. Obviously, they're not consuming the vessel itself. When he says, "For this is my blood of the covenant," that has led Catholic theologians to establish what is known as the doctrine of transubstantiation. The belief that the wine literally becomes the blood of Jesus when it is blessed by the priest. So it started out as fruit of the vine. Jesus said, "This is my blood," and then it goes through a transformation, a change in substance, transubstantiation, and then becomes literally the blood of Jesus. Which is why, if you've ever been to a Catholic Mass, when communion is served, the bread is that which the worshipers can partake of, but only the priest drinks of the fruit of the vine, or the blood of Jesus.
Always?
That's been changed.
That's been changed, though, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's been changed. Originally, that was the case because they were concerned that people would be spilling the blood of Christ on the floor, and so, but they've changed that over the years to where now people can choose to either partake of the wine or to pass during the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
What happens if they do spill it?
Well, I mean,
Doesn't he give him out of the cup himself, or is that just old tradition?
Well, a lot of times what you'll see is that he's got the vessel, then he's got this cloth, and then you're going to get a little sip out of it like that. But they don't do it like, at least what I've seen, they'll do it like we do, where everybody's got their own individual cup.
No, you've got to get in line and go up to the front, and you have to take it from a Eucharistic minister.
Yeah.
Those are my favorite kind.
I've seen where they dip the bread in the wine for you then too, so that you get a little bit of it that way.
Really? I haven't seen that.
It's on a movie.
No, I saw it in.
When Jesus said that he dipped the bread, what does he mean by that? Or was it dipping in it?
Probably it was kind of an oil-based thing. Like if you go to an Italian restaurant and they have this oil stuff that you kind of salt the bread in.
Mm-hmm.
We're presuming that's as part of the Passover meal. That was something that they were doing there.
Denny, I mean, this may not be the best place to bring this up, but can we look from this example and see that we are scripturally to ask a separate prayer for the bread and for the cup? Because I've seen, it's only happened once or twice, but somebody trying to take a shortcut to speed things up offers one prayer for both.
Yeah. I like to go with the example, and the example is one prayer in each part is isolated and receives its own significance.
Okay.
And so I think, I don't know that I would be able to say that it's sinful to do that, but it certainly is not following the biblical model that is given, and Paul comes back to this in 1 Corinthians 11 and does the same thing. talking about how each part was isolated and given its own significance. So,
Okay.
all right. So when you talk about this doctrine of transubstantiation, you say, well, how do you argue against that? Because the fact of the matter is, he did, once he blessed it, say, this is my blood. Verse 28. Well, the answer to that is found in verse 29. But I say to you, I will not drink of this. What does your Bible say?
Fruit of the vine.
Huh?
Mine says fruit of the vine.
Fruit of the vine. Well, wait a minute. I thought it turned into his blood. Jesus turns right around and still calls it fruit of the vine after he called it his blood. That right there proves that it didn't change into anything. That it's still a metonymy. It's still representing his blood, but it is not his blood. And so the doctrine of transubstantiation truly has no biblical foundation whatsoever. It's still fruit of the vine, even though it was blessed by Jesus and it was called his blood by Jesus. Well, what is that? It's a metonymy. That's what it is. And so there's your answer to that particular argument. Now, it says that this is the blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many for forgiveness of sins. We learn when we read Exodus 24 and verse 8 that the first covenant was made effective by blood. The word that's used is ratified. A covenant is ratified by the shedding of blood. Exodus 24:8. Also write down Zechariah 9 and verse 11. So as the first covenant was ratified by blood, so also is the second. There's no way that we can have a relationship with God, be a part of his covenant family, without the shedding of blood. And this is a point of discussion in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 through 22. Now, some have also wondered, why does Jesus say that his blood was shed on behalf of many as opposed to all? Well, the way language works, sometimes we're trying to make a big deal in English when in Greek it would not have been a big deal at all. But the idea is the idea of the masses. His blood is shed on behalf of the masses, the many who live, the multitudes of people who live. It's not meant to be a mathematical percentage, many as opposed to all, 80% as opposed to 100%. It's a word meant to be understood as for the many, the masses of people who live. Unfortunately, we know that Jesus' blood was shed for far more people than those who will actually benefit from it. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. All right, so Jesus here gives us a reflection of the Messianic banquet. He's encouraging them that someday they will enjoy uninterrupted fellowship in the Father's kingdom. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, we've seen a distinction between the kingdom of the Father and the kingdom of the Son. Here he says, I will not drink it new with you until we do it in my Father's kingdom. That's heaven. So those that have used this text to say that Jesus promised that whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper, He is with us. He is present with us today. Well, you can't base it on this verse because Jesus isn't saying that. Jesus is saying that this is something that is a precursor to what we will be doing for eternity in my Father's kingdom. Verse 30, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is still today a very beautiful place to visit with olive trees in abundance and lots of flowers. And you've got these walking paths that you can go look at. Also, in verse 36, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. You've got the Garden of Gethsemane mentioned. But anyway, they went to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered." That's Zechariah 13 and verse 7. Pointed out earlier that the book of Zechariah is heavily drawn from in the last chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, and this is yet another example. Zechariah prophesied, and Jesus says it's going to happen, that all of you are going to be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Now, we've kind of blown right through these, and I apologize for that, but the suffering text number 9, is in verses 20 through 24. And then number 10 is in verse 28, where Jesus talks about His blood being shed. Number 11 suffering text is found in verse 31, where Jesus talks about striking down the shepherd, a quotation from Zechariah 13. And then suffering text number 12 is in verses 38 and 39. So there are 12 times since Peter's confession, 12 times that Jesus makes reference to suffering and or death. He says, "But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee." But Peter answered and said to him, "Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." So Peter boldly proclaims that, yeah, there may be some of these other guys that will betray you, fall away from you. It'll never happen with me. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you that this very night, before a cock crows, you shall deny me 3 times." The cock crow was a designation for the third Roman watch of the night, from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. So in effect, Jesus is saying, if we were going to reframe this in modern terminology, he's saying before dawn, you will have denied me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing too. Peter and all are still thinking of the strong-armed military warlord They're expecting to fight. They're ready to fight. And you know what? They were. I mean, that part is not fluff. That's not just talk. They were ready to go to battle with Jesus. But they were not ready for what eventually happened. All right, verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. Tradition has located this garden in a grove on the lower slope of the mount across from the Kidron Valley, east of Jerusalem. And these are some of the pictures that I took from this spot. Gethsemane. There's Jerusalem from the garden.
So this was just outside the weeping wall or whatever it is.
Yeah, Wailing Wall. Yeah. That gate that is kind of blurry that you can see there that's closed up is that Golden Gate that they don't use it anymore, but it's more of a kind of a tourist place to go visit. All right, so in verse 36 through 46, we've got Jesus in Gethsemane. And this section, perhaps more so than any other section, emphasizes and demonstrates the humanity of Jesus. He came to a place called Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, and began to be grieved and distressed. The terrors of death, the brutality of the cross are now confronting Jesus. And he said, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as thou wilt." All right, Jesus prayed this prayer 3 times. But his desire to do God's will was always that which was predominant. He comes back in verse 40 and finds the disciples asleep and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" Just a few minutes or a few hours earlier, he was boasting of his loyalty. Well, some defender of Jesus sleeping on the job here. Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This is going to be a trying night for everybody. And as we know, everybody fails. Peter fails and yields to temptation by denying Jesus 3 times. He went away a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away until I drink it, thy will be done." The word "cannot" here is interesting because, in effect, Jesus is saying, is there another way? Does it have to be this way? And the answer was no. And so, thy will be done. And he came back and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. He left them again and went away and prayed a 3rd time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. All right, so we talked about the 12 suffering texts, but now beginning in Matthew 26 and verse 47, we have the beginning of suffering. So there are no more suffering texts. Now we have the beginning of what Jesus had predicted 12 times was going to happen. While he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12. I think it's interesting that Matthew, through inspiration, reminds us that this just isn't anybody that is about to betray Jesus. This is Judas. This is one of the 12. Came up accompanied by a great multitude with swords and clubs from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now they obviously anticipated considerable resistance. Why? We don't know. But nevertheless, they're coming looking for a fight. Now it's interesting that the presence of Judas is mentioned by all 4 gospel accounts. Shows that it made a very deep impression on them. Now, this is where, in verse 51, we read about the servant of the high priest, ear being cut off. We're told in the Gospel of John that it was Peter that did this. Matthew doesn't tell us who it was that did it, just one of those who were with Jesus.
Hey, Denny,
Yes.
you said a little while ago that they were ready to fight. Would any of them have been trained to be able to fight successfully against a soldier, or were they just so impassioned by protecting him that they said, we're just going to fight?
The irony is, the only one that would have received military training is the one that's betraying him. Maybe Simon would have had some, probably would have, I guess, but Judas, what we know about him, might have had some military background. And then we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I want to go back and point out the unscripturalness of the trial, or the illegality of the trial. But he's still concerned about fulfilling Scripture. All right, so this text, bringing us all the way through chapter 27, has a number of things take place that were illegal. Illegal because they were against Mosaic law or against Jewish law. First of all, he's arrested without a formal charge. Verse 48, now he was betraying him, gave them a sign saying, whoever I shall kiss, he is the one, seize him. And immediately he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. Now apparently Jesus was unknown by sight to the multitude, so he had to be specifically identified by Judas. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. And they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. It's interesting that every time the word friend is used in Matthew, the person addressed is in the wrong. Jesus would address them as friend, but nevertheless they were guilty of doing something that they should not have been doing, as here.
Do you have another biblical example of that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
How about 2013?
Perfect.
22:12. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus, again, John identifies this as Peter, John 18, verse 10, reached and drew out a sword and struck the slave of the high priest. Again, John 18, verse 10 tells us that this was, man's name was Malchus. Cut off his ear. Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place. For all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Resistance is futile. It's unnecessary. The use of force is that which provokes man and is not going to accomplish the will of God. Jesus wants to maintain control over the situation. He already he was going to explain to Pilate in John 18, verse 36, my servants do not fight. Well, Peter is kind of messing that up a little bit here. But he tells Peter and the others, do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Now we sing a song, he could have called 10,000 angels, but the number's not right. A legion is 6,000. So 12 legions of angels make 72,000 angels. But it just doesn't fit the song. He could have called 72,000. It doesn't roll with it. It's good as 10,000 angels. But 72,000 angels were at his disposal, not meant to be viewed as a literal number, 72,000 as opposed to 71,999 or something like that. But when we think about the power that angels had, you think about 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35. One angel kills 185,000 soldiers of the Assyrian army.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
185,000 soldiers were killed by an angel in 2 Kings 19:35. So Jesus could call 72,000 angels. I think that could more than accomplish any problem that might be encountered here. So he doesn't need Peter to whip out his one sword and do anything. Verse 54, how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen this way? Jesus had to go to the cross. It was the only way scripture could be fulfilled. It was the only way he could be the sacrificial Lamb of God. It's the only way that he could be Jesus, which means what? Savior. He had to go to the cross. He had to become the Lamb of God. Verse 55, at that time Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. Jesus rebukes them for coming after him like he was some common criminal. And I'm with you every single day in the temple teaching. But what he's doing is he's pointing out the atrocity of the event. That this whole thing is a sham. It's a joke. It's a travesty of justice, whatever or however you want to frame it. Verse 57, and those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, we talked about who Caiaphas was in the last class, but you've got him, and you've got scribes and elders gathered together. What we know is that a court of 23 was all that was needed for capital cases. Now, there were how many that were part of the Sanhedrin? 70. But you only needed 23 to try a capital case. Now, according to the Mishnah, unless a trial takes place in daylight, a death penalty cannot be given. And so this was in violation of Jewish law because it was at night. Now, some might argue that this was a preliminary trial to see if there were enough charges that could be accumulated to warrant a capital trial, but there's no evidence really one way or the other. Verse 58, but Peter also followed him at a distance. You know, we talked about how in the Gospel of Matthew the word followed is one of our key words. We're constantly identifying the fact that Jesus had lots of followers. And now we have Matthew just pointing out Peter following, but at a distance. And so also is there a spiritual lesson for us today, is that there are people that want to follow Jesus, sure, at a distance though. Don't want to become a Bible thumper, over spiritual, excessively righteous person. Don't get too close to Jesus. Follow him, but at a distance. It's kind of a spiritual application there. He followed him as far as the courtyard of the high priest and entered in and sat down with the officers. See the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus in order that they might put him to death. So they're working hard to find false witnesses. Who can we get that will say what we want them to say as witness against Jesus? And they did not find it, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward. All right, so this is the third illegality in this trial, and that is they brought forth false witnesses. Now, according to Deuteronomy 19:15, you had to have at least two witnesses. They finally get two witnesses that had similar testimony. It sounds as if the previous witnesses were willing to lie, but they couldn't get their stories to line up. And the two men stated, and the man stated, if I am able to destroy the temple of God, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, to speak against the temple was viewed as a most serious offense. And so their testimony then is centered around temple language, and that Jesus was going to do damage somehow to the temple. Now, in Mark's parallel account, Mark 14, verse 58, Mark shows that there was disagreement in the details of the witnesses, proving them to be false witnesses. Does anybody know what Mosaic law required for a false witness in a capital case?
2 or 3 witnesses.
What was going to happen if they were proven to be false witnesses in a capital case?
Were they stoned?
They were stoned. Now think of the logic behind that. If your testimony was that which brought about a death of somebody, then that person ended up being innocent, but they were put to death because of your false testimony, then you were guilty of murder. And what do you do with murderers? Stone. So that's why a false witness was stoned, because he was guilty of murder. And the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" Jesus is committed to doing God's will. So he chose no defense. Now, Matthew has already shown on more than one occasion that Jesus could outwit anyone. And this high priest, Caiaphas, was no match for Jesus. He could have talked himself out of this, no problem. But Jesus was determined to go to the cross. So, verse 63, he kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." All right, Jesus did not identify with the mistaken Jewish Messiah. But he did identify with the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7. Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself." Now, that is a statement of affirmation. What you just said is true. "Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting in the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." All right, so that's where Jesus identifies with the Son of Man of Daniel 7:13. All right, the high priest tore his robes. That was the fourth part of this that was in violation of Mosaic law. According to Leviticus 21:10. Also, I don't have this on the PowerPoint, but put this in your notes. The high priest could not cast the first vote. His was to be the last vote. As we would say, the tiebreaker, in case you've got an even number on both sides of the vote. The high priest would cast the deciding vote. He was number 71. The Sanhedrin had 70, and then the high priest made it 71. But now the high priest is casting the first vote. Well, that was not the way it was supposed to be done.
Are you saying he was voting by tearing his?
Yeah, what he says, "What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have all heard the blasphemy." So his judgment has already been issued right there. Not the tearing of the robes necessarily, but what he says afterwards. All right, yes.
At this point in time, had the Roman Empire started appointing the high priest if they didn't like it?
Yeah.
Okay. So he may not have been the true high priest according to...
Annas was the high priest that was appointed by the Jews. Caiaphas was the guy that the Romans
Appointed.
appointed.
Okay.
All right, so the fifth offense was Jesus was offered no opportunity for self-defense. So he asked them, what do you think? And they answered and said, he is deserving of death. Well, that becomes the sixth illegality. They were required to summon those who were to defend him. But they announced and pronounced the death decree right then and there. Then they spat in his face, and they beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. Spitting in somebody's face was considered to be the supreme insult. We see illustrations of this in the Old Testament, like Numbers 12 and verse 14, Deuteronomy 25 and verse 9, Isaiah 50 and verse 6. So they are doing the supreme acts of humiliation, the insult, supreme insult of Jesus, beating him with their fists. They're not slapping him, they're pounding on him. And then others are slapping him. And said, prophesy to us, you, Christ. Who is the one who hits you? So not only the physical abuse, but the verbal abuse. And of course, Jesus could have easily answered that question, but to what end at this point? Now, other points that are related to what's happening right here, a man could not condemn or accuse himself, according to Deuteronomy 17 and verse 6. But the high priest's judgment is not based upon the false witnesses, but upon what Jesus himself said. Well, that was not sufficient grounds for a death sentence, according to Mosaic law. And even though they're saying that what Jesus said was blasphemous, verse 65, you have now heard the blasphemy. His words were not blasphemous because he did not curse God. That would have been blasphemy. All right, verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside the courtyard, and a certain servant girl came to him and said, you too were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you're talking about. And when he had gone out to the gateway, apparently he wanted to get out of that environment, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Now recognize that Jesus is being condemned. And what was taking place with the high priest and the Sanhedrin would not have been in a closed door inner room where nobody else has any knowledge of what's going on. The fact of the matter is, those present would have known that the judgment had been made against Jesus. He was a blasphemer. He was deserving of death. Well, he's an evil man. He's a wicked man. He's a man that is going to be put to death. Oh, you were with him, weren't you? you're one of the guys that traveled about with him. Well, Peter knows, and everybody else knows, what had just been decreed against Jesus. And so, to admit that he was a disciple at this point would have looped him in to this travesty of a trial, and perhaps would have also meant persecution or death for himself. He doesn't have the backbone in order to stand up and say, yes, you're right, that is me, and I was with him. Verse 73, a little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, surely you too are one of them, for the way you talk gives you away. All right, he had a Galilean accent. He's not from these parts. This is in Jerusalem. He's from Galilee up north, and even in Bible times they talked differently. But rather than take care of it with accent, Peter chooses to take care of it with profanity. Verse 74, he began to curse and swear, I do not know the man. You can just imagine how emphatic and ugly, vindictive that Peter is saying these words as he sprinkles it with profanity. And immediately a cock crowed. Well, in effect, Peter is pronouncing a curse upon himself because he is lying. He is one that was with Jesus. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, before a cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now, when you look at the parallel account of this in Luke 22, verse 61, to indicate how this was something that was wide open, when Peter denied Jesus that 3rd time and the cock crowed, he turned and looked at Peter. Now that's a face you wouldn't want to see right then. Luke 22:61. Chapter 27. Now when morning had come, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. So once morning came, the whole council gets together to ratify the death sentence that was reached during the night. That was a 9th illegality that took place, because you can't conclude a capital offense within a 24-hour period of time. Now, another way to try to organize the events, because this is one whirlwind night with all of these various events, was to think about the stops that Jesus had. The first stop was with Caiaphas, and now the second stop is going to be with Pilate. The night that Jesus spent in prison is believed to have been in one of these rooms. They feel pretty certain that the court of Antonio was the area, and that this was the original prison area underneath the courtyard. And whether this is true or not true is open to intense debate. But nevertheless, it's still kind of sobering to think that this might have been the very place in which Jesus spent his last night before being crucified.
Hey, Denny, what is on the glass? Is that glass?
It is, it's just, a Catholic mural where they're trying to give you a visual of Jesus sitting.
So that wouldn't have been on there if somebody was actually in. I'm not saying a picture of him. I'm saying, would they have had,
No.
I didn't know if maybe prisoners might have painted on them or something.
Their walls would have been all that was there.
I wasn't saying that they had Jesus' mural up when he was in there. I just thought it was interesting that was up at all. Man.
All right, so the second
Dara.
stop is to Pilate. Verse 2, they bound him and led him away and delivered him up to Pilate the governor. They still needed Pilate in order to kill him. They couldn't themselves kill him according to their law, but we got to get Pilate to do the dirty deed. And when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, felt remorse, and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. Now, this is the section where Judas tries to undo his betrayals. The text says that he felt remorse.
Denny?
Yes.
What would, I mean, big deal. Why wouldn't they just kill him? I mean, they've already done all this other stuff that was illegal. I mean, what were they worried about?
They still are trying to show some signs of nobility that, they're trying to do it according to law, when in fact, they're ignoring law on every front. But to get the Romans to do it would have been a whole lot easier to explain to their Jewish friends than if they had done it themselves and killed him, stoned him. All right, the fact that he felt remorse suggests that Judas did not expect this to happen the way it did. He did not expect Jesus to be condemned. And now that he is condemned and Jesus is allowing them to beat on him and spit on him, mock him, that makes Judas feel, and this is not at all what I expected. He tries to return the money. Maybe he did it initially for money, but now he's trying to return the money. And he tells them, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Judas is confessing that what he has done was wrong. And when you look at Old Testament passages like Exodus 23 and verse 7, and Deuteronomy 27 verse 25, that's Exodus 23, 7, and Deuteronomy 27, 25, the leaders of God's people would be concerned about making sure that justice prevailed. And now you actually do have a witness coming forward saying, this guy is innocent. That right there should have brought a screeching halt to this kangaroo trial, this joke of a trial that's going on. But instead they say, what is that to us? See to that yourself. So what was Judas thinking? Did he think it would end differently? Was he thinking that he would force Jesus' hand to be the strong-armed Messiah? Well, this side of eternity, we're not really going to know for certain. And he threw the pieces of silver into the sanctuary and departed and went away and hanged himself. And the chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it is not lawful. Can you believe this? It is not lawful. Now they're concerned about temple purity. They're not concerned about justice, and they're not concerned about putting to death an innocent man. But, we can't defile the temple by taking this money. It would defile the sanctuary to put that betrayal money back into the temple treasury, because it was the price of blood. So they counseled together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Now, what that means is from the day it happened to the day that Matthew recorded his gospel. So 20 some odd years later, it's still called the field of blood. Verse 9, and that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Now, yet again, another quotation that comes from Zechariah, chapter 11, verses 12 and 13.
Hey, Denny, did, in your tours, did they ever point out where this field was? I mean, is that another known place?
Yeah. It is a place on the southern edge of the city, which actually is not too far from the valley of Gehenna, where they burn the trash and all that.
What verse was that you said?
Zechariah 11, verses 12 and 13. Now, you might look at this again and say, all right, we have a problem. And the problem that we have is, Matthew says this was what was spoken through Jeremiah. But then he turns right around and quotes Zechariah 11. So how do you reconcile this apparent contradiction in Scripture? And as you deal with people that point out contradictions, they almost always will bring this up. All right, what you need to understand, and what they failed to understand, is that the Jews had the Old Testament classified into three categories. And the first book in a category sometimes was called the heading for that entire category. And so, for example, you had the law. Well, the first book of the books of law was Genesis. And so they might be quoting from Leviticus or Numbers, but they'll say in Genesis. And what they mean is the Genesis grouping. The first book in all of the prophetic books was Jeremiah. And so even though he's quoting from Zechariah, he references it to be Jeremiah, and it's the idea of it's in the prophetic writings of which Jeremiah is the head book in that particular grouping. Now, that's an eyebrow raiser. I mean, that's a little weird to us, and I don't care about that. I mean, if it's weird to us, what difference does that make? The fact of the matter is that's the way the Jews did it. And so you've got people that say contradiction right there, clear as day. But they haven't done their homework enough to understand the way the Jews classified and referred to a collection of writings by the first book in that writing. And so a Jew would not even miss a beat as he would read through this and say, well, he says it's Jeremiah, but it's really Zechariah. To a Jew, they perfectly understand how that works. All right, verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor questioning him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? Now we're picking up where we left off in verse 2. We had a kind of an aside in talking about and wrapping up the Judas story. while this trial is going on, Judas, meanwhile, is trying to undo what he had done, try to stop it from going any further. He fails. He commits suicide, and then we talk about what the chief priest did with the money. Now, back to the trial. This is the court of Antonio. This, again, is underneath the courtyard proper. And it is believed that it is this place where what we're reading about right now took place, where Jesus is standing before the governor, and the governor is saying, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "It is as you say." All right, so this is the trial before Pilate in that particular courtyard, perhaps. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he made no answer. And Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear the many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge, so that the governor was quite amazed. So as we noted earlier, so also do we note here, Jesus had to work hard to be crucified. Not to keep from being crucified, but to be crucified. Isaiah 53 and verse 6, Jesus is fulfilling, even though Matthew is not going to reference Isaiah 53 verse 6, he certainly could have. Verse 15. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the multitude any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they were holding at that time a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Barabbas was a political prisoner, and political prisoners were often popular with the masses. To release a political prisoner would increase Pilate's popularity. It said, when therefore they were gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Now, when we put together all of the gospel accounts, we learn that Barabbas was also in prison for robbery, John 18, verse 40. And was in prison for murder, Mark 15 and verse 7.
What would make him a political prisoner then?
Probably because he was opposed to Roman rule, I guess. But he was a notorious prisoner. Everybody knew of this guy. Now, what's interesting is that some Greek manuscripts actually have his name as Jesus Barabbas. So they're asked to choose between two men called Jesus. Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ? Which Jesus do you want? For he knew that because of envy, they had delivered him up. Pilate was an astute official, and he knew what the Sanhedrin was all about. He had seen their games, he had seen their evil, he had seen their wickedness, and they just didn't like Jesus, and they were envious of him. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, remember that you stood up while you were hearing evidence. You sat down when you were ready to make a proclamation. So he has sat down. He's about ready to make his proclamation, his judgment. His wife sent to him saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." this particular event is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And according to history, this woman's name was Procla, Procla. People gave great credence to dreams. You did not take dreams lightly, especially if you were a ruler or the wife of a ruler and you had dreams. They took those very seriously, and Procla is trying to tell her husband Pilate, you don't want to go there with this guy, based upon the dreams that she had. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. Now this must have surprised Pilate, because he knew how popular Jesus was with the multitudes. And now the multitudes themselves are turning against Jesus, but it's the chief priests and the elders that are persuading the people to do this. But the governor answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. Again, this goes along with Mark 15 and verse 11, where the chief priests are prompting the people to ask for Barabbas. He said to them, what then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? They all said, let him be crucified. Now, even to the Romans that were those that used crucifixion as the death penalty, it was an especially brutal act, reserved solely for the very worst of the worst among their criminal population. They did not crucify frequently, but only the worst. And so that explains why Pilate responds in verse 23, why? What evil has he done? I mean, you want our worst method of execution to be applied to this guy. What has he done that is so bad that this is what you want to happen? They're not going to answer that. They just keep shouting, let him be crucified. No evidence is going to be offered. And when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather a riot was starting. Now you've got to note that Pilate says, all right, I'm going to have to act, and I'm going to have to act right away here, because it's getting out of control. He took water and washed his hands in front of the multitude, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Well, they're saying if what we're doing is all that bad, then we are wishing a curse on ourselves and on future generations. That's pretty strong. But amazingly, they were still offered forgiveness by God. But we also read about, after they were offered forgiveness, like on the day of Pentecost, and in Acts chapter 3, verse 17, and now, brethren, I know that you acted in ignorance, just as your rulers did also. But interestingly, when we get to Acts chapter 5 and verse 28, they say, We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in his name, and behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Okay? Let's go back to the clock and repeat what it was that you said on that day. His blood be upon us and upon our children. But in Acts 5:28, they're saying, don't be putting that guy's blood on us. Well, they asked for it. But yet they were still offered forgiveness. What a great point to make about the forgiving nature of God. Verse 26, then he released Barabbas for them, but Jesus he scourged and delivered over to be crucified. Now a Roman citizen could not be scourged or flogged. We learn that in the story of Paul in Acts 22:24 through 29. But Jesus could be flogged or scourged. And in Matthew 20, verse 19, he predicted that he would be. Scourging was such a brutal act because typically there would be a post that would be about waist high, and you were bent over that post, and basically your hands were tied by your feet, and the skin on your back was stretched tight. And then a whip that had pieces of rock and glass were tied into the tips of the scourge, and then you were whipped, and the scourge, the leather strips would swing around, and the pieces of rock and glass would embed itself in your skin, and then the soldier would yank it, and it would rip open the skin. History records that there were men that died right then and there, because if the whip made itself all the way around and embedded in the person's belly, and then he yanked it, it literally just ripped everything wide open, and his insides just jumped out and died on the spot. So this was something we talk about, the weakened state of Jesus. It wasn't because Jesus wasn't a strong man. It was because scourging was so brutal that he lost a lot of blood in all probability, and was greatly weakened by this particular act. All right, verse 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. All right, a battalion or a cohort was 400 to 600 men. So Jesus is surrounded by a very large number of soldiers. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after weaving a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they kneeled down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." All right, so they're dressing him up in the robes of royalty with a makeshift crown. The crown of thorns is something that is frequently seen in Palestine even today, that where it's got needles on it that are 2 to 3 inches long. And so as soon as they put that on his head, those long needles would have penetrated skin for sure. Yet again, more bleeding. They're spitting on him again. They took the reed and began to beat him on the head. Imagine the love that God must have had to allow this travesty to continue. To allow, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," to have these guys beat him and spit on him and mock him. And God watches, but does nothing. Well, how much did he love us in order to allow that to happen to his son? And they had mocked him, and they took his robe, and they put his garments on him, and they led him away to crucify him. Now, these soldiers would not have had anything against Jesus personally, but they just enjoyed beating up Jews. They had a chance to beat up some Jew. They were all in. And as they were coming out, they found a certain Cyrenian named Simon. This man they pressed into service to bear his cross. Now, the way Mark records this, Mark 15:21, he named Simon's two sons, which you would not do unless the two sons were familiar to the readers. And that has led scholars to believe that this man and his children became Christians, which is kind of cool if that's in fact what that is indicating. Now, one of the great misnomers, and something that is fostered by the Catholic Church, is that Jesus fell under the weight of the cross. There is not a solitary passage that says that Jesus fell under the weight of the cross. Zippo. Now, John, chapter 19, verse 17, is the only gospel writer to even record that Jesus carried his own cross. Now, the place where Jesus would have walked would have been on a street similar to this. And they have the Via Dolorosa, the Way of the Cross, with its various stations all marked, including the place that Jesus fell under the weight of the cross, is all marked. But the fact of the matter is, the actual city streets that Jesus would have walked on are about 12 to 15 feet below this street. So it's not even the same streets, nor would we have known exactly what was the way that he went from the court of Antonio to the place of the cross.
Are you talking 10 to 15 feet below the ground surface or down on the mountain?
Below the ground surface.
Okay.
So on this street here, it's all built on on top of the old city.
I got you.
All right, it says, and when they had come to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. When you go see this, and my pictures are not going to do it justice, but can you see what looks like a skull in that? It is amazing, but in all probability, because that skull-like formation in the rock still exists today, that it's presumed that this was the place of the crucifixion. On top of that, where you can see kind of some bushes. Now, what is hard to visualize is, as I'm taking this picture, the city wall is right here. I mean, it's just right here. So, and the wall would have been up, and so people almost could have looked straight across at the side of the crucifixion. And you could have taken a rock and gone like that, and it landed at the foot of the cross from the city wall to where he's crucified. Now, if you're like me, you envision some, 50, 60, 70 yards or something like that distance from the city of Jerusalem to the place of the crucifixion, but, it's right outside the city. It is right outside the city wall.
From the picture, it looks like that's decently high up. How would they get up there? Was there a clear path to that, or was there?
Yeah, if you go around the right side, you can walk up there. They didn't let us do that, but you could.
Wow.
All right, it says they gave him wine to drink mingled with gall. That comes from Psalm 69, verse 21. And even though Matthew is not going to say any more about it than that, a Jew by now is certainly getting it, that there are just one event after another that is indicating the fulfillment of Old Testament Scripture.
What was gall?
Gall was a vinegar wine mix, and it was apparently super nasty tasting, sour. But that's what it is. The vinegar, gall was the vinegar. And after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots. Again, that would have reminded a Jew of Psalm 22:18. Apparently, the Roman soldiers were part of their pay was to have whatever the crucified man had in his possession, including his clothing. And they're dividing up his garments, casting lots for those garments, because Jesus had one particular garment that was all one large piece, and that was not something that could have been divided up without ruining the whole thing. In 1968, there was a very unusual discovery that was made, and that was a skeleton of an unnamed man that still had nails in his heel. So, his heel bone. That was the first and only time they'd ever discovered something like that.
Yeah, I've always wondered how exactly did they drive the nail through the feet? Like, how did they line them up to...
Well, this helped us. The 1968 discovery was if you've got his foot, and his foot is that which is pointing down, that they apparently must have gone in higher than... I've always kind of visualized that it was a little bit lower. They said if you went lower, then you actually would have ripped yourself through and kind of freed your foot. But if you do it up here, and then you go into the heel bone, then there's no way you're going to break yourself free. Same with the hand. We keep thinking that it's here, but in all probability it was up here. Because if it was here, you could rip yourself all the way out this way.
And also, were the nails, was that specifically for Jesus, or were a lot of people crucified with nails, or somebody said that, or I've heard before that people got tied up there sometimes? Was it typically with nails for everybody, or was that?
I don't think we have enough evidence to answer that with any certainty. We know they used nails. We found the nails in burial places, but this was the first time we'd ever found a nail actually in the foot, the bone. But it seems like the only thing about ropes is something that some historians have made reference to, but how accurate they are, we're not really sure.
Also, do we have any proof? I've heard different people during the Lord's Supper say that they were dull and they had to really drive them through. Is there any proof whether they were sharp or dull or any of that?
No.
So that's just up for speculation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody else?
How would they drive the nail through the heel bone without breaking the bone?
It would split it. for sure. The heel bone generally is kind of a soft cartilage, and so it would expand. Apparently, it would expand some, but I think it would still have to split it to some degree.
But what about in Jesus' case where it says there were no broken bones?
Well, with I don't know, they're kind of getting back to Rob's question. That's because some say, well, with Jesus, it wasn't he wasn't crucified the normal way, but there's he's asking them to look at the imprint of the nails, so he even makes reference to nails. So whatever happened to Jesus didn't break a bone. Now, did it? I don't know if we're getting too
Relocate them?
nitpicky. What's that?
Relocate them?
Yeah. Okay, it says, and sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. Keep watch means that they wanted to keep his friends from rescuing him and to verify his death. They basically had a twofold job of guarding a crucified man, to keep friends from rescuing him and to verify his death. And they put above his head the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now, we learn in the parallel accounts that Pilate wrote this inscription, even though there was some objection to the inscription. But there's an irony to it, because there is none that has worn the title since. Jesus has stood before the world for 2,000 years as the King of the Jews. And at that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right, one on the left. And those who were passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads. This was a derogatory action back in biblical times. And saying, "You who destroyed the temple and rebuilt it in 3 days, save yourselves. You're such a big man. You can make bold predictions about tearing down something that took 46 years to build. Well, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." And that would be an easy thing for the Son of God to do. You see, these people have been so blind to his previous miracles that even if Jesus did this, now visualize Jesus going, pop,
Right.
pop, pop, floats down. Would they have believed? You see, you've got to have a heart disposed to believe, where you are a truth seeker and you are willing to allow the evidence to win the day. And with all that Jesus has done, their hearts were so blind, so hardened, that if they couldn't and wouldn't believe the earlier miracles, they'd find a way to excuse this miracle as well. Verse 43, "He trusts in God, let him deliver him now, if he takes pleasure in him, for he said, I am the Son of God." Again, making reference to Psalm 22, which actually is a psalm that is heavily used in this section. So you've got Zechariah and you've got the Psalms that are tapped into frequently in these last chapters. Verse 44, "And the robbers who had been crucified with him were casting the same insult at him." Now, when we read the parallel account in Luke 23, verses 39 and 4 through 43, he completes the story regarding one of the robbers, who apparently started out mocking Jesus with the others. But as the time wore on, and maybe the hours wore on, he began to realize what an atrocity this was and what an offense it was to be making fun of and mocking Jesus. And so he stopped it and asked Jesus for forgiveness. Verse 45, now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon all the land until the 9th hour. Now Mark tells us that the crucifixion took place at the 3rd hour, which would have been 9 a.m. And so darkness that hits at the 6th hour, that had been high noon, 12 o'clock. Now, normally at 12 o'clock it doesn't become dark, but it did on this day. And it continued to stay dark until the 9th hour, which would have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So there were 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day. And about the 9th hour, so Jesus has been on the cross now for 6 hours. Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? All right, Jesus here is speaking Aramaic. And again, this comes from Psalm 22 and verse 1. Now, Mark and Matthew give only one saying from the cross. We get 3 from Luke, and we get 3 from John. And when we put them all together, we get the 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. But this is the only one that Matthew records. With these words, we're seeing the humanity of Jesus be expressed. We talk about the agony of the cross, and normally we refer to the intensive pain that Jesus must have endured. But don't just stop with the physical pain, but the mental pain as well. Jesus, at this point, is feeling forsaken. And certainly at some level we could understand why that would be the case. And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave him a drink. This is the one act of human kindness extended to Jesus in his last hours. But the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come and save him. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. It's interesting when you look carefully at the terminology there in verse 50, is that Jesus voluntarily yielded up his spirit. He voluntarily died for our sins. He didn't have to go to the cross. He didn't have to die. But like Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3, this was a choice that Jesus made to die for our sins. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. the veil was that which separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And it was extremely thick, according to these Old Testament texts that describe this veil, like Exodus 26:31 and following. So imagine something that would be like the thick phone book of a big city, just suddenly ripping in two. That veil that separated the most holy place from the Holy of Holies. And as soon as the veil was torn, it was no longer a holy place. That exposed it, that defiled it. Now, the symbolism of that is significant, because that is no longer a holy place. That is no longer the place where inside the Holy of Holies you had the Ark of the Covenant, which had long been lost, but it was still considered to be the throne of God. But with the veil being torn in a symbolic way, it's no longer the presence of God. It's no longer a holy place. Holiness is not going to be found in the temple. Holiness is not going to be found in the Holy of Holies. All right, then it says, and rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Now, the earthquake and the resurrection are unique to Matthew. So, other than this one brief statement, nothing else is said about them. Now, there are two views. When you look at verse 53, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. One is that they were raised after Jesus. Others say they were raised before Jesus, but they didn't appear until after he was raised. So you've got the earthquake, the rock splitting, tombs open, bodies of saints coming out of the tombs, but they didn't appear until after Jesus' resurrection. But since this is the only account of this, to say for certain what exactly happened is futile. We just don't know for sure. Now the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly, this was Son of God." These men have never seen anything like this before. And all attention is certainly focused upon Jesus. And they come to a conclusion. They overheard the crowd saying, "He says he's the Son of God." Well, now the soldiers are saying, maybe he was right. And many women were there looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him. We get more information about this from the Gospel of Luke, but we frequently only visualize Jesus going from place to place with the 12. But apparently there was a large contingent of followers in addition to the 12, including women. And these women ministered to him as they followed him from place to place. Now, what does that mean? Well, scholars say they did what women would have been so highly trained to do: cook, clean, wash, and so they ministered to Jesus in those ways as they followed him from place to place. Okay, we'll pick up there after chapel.